Hindutva and history. Unsurprisingly, a later period of Indian history, following the Muslim conquests of North India, has become ground zero in the battle of narratives between Team Hindutva and the pluralists. When, with the publication of my 2016 book Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, I spoke of 200 years of foreign rule. I found it interesting that at the same time the Hindutva Brigade, led by Prime Minister Modi himself, was speaking of 1,200 years of foreign rule. To them, the Muslim rulers of India, whether the Delhi Sultans, the Deccani Sultans or the Mughals, or the hundreds of other Muslims who occupied thrones of greater or lesser importance for several hundred years across the country, were all foreigners. I responded that while the founder of a Muslim dynasty may have come to India from abroad, he and his descendants stayed and assimilated in this country, married Hindu women, and immersed themselves in the fortunes of this land. Each Mughal emperor after Babur had less and less connection of blood or allegiance to a foreign country. If they looted or exploited India and Indians, they spent the proceeds of their loot in India, and did not send it off to enrich a foreign land as the British did. The Mughals received travelers from the Ferghana Valley politely, inquired about the well-being of the people there and perhaps even gave some money for the upkeep of the graves of their Chingizid ancestors, but they stopped seeing their original homeland as home. By the second generation, let alone the fifth or sixth, they were as Indian as any Hindu. This challenge of authenticity, however, cuts across a wide intellectual terrain. It emerges from those Hindus who share V.S. Naipaul's view of theirs as a wounded civilization, a pristine Hindu land that was subjected to repeated defeats and conquests over the centuries at the hands of rapacious Muslim invaders and was enfeebled and subjugated in the process. To such people, independence is not merely British rule but an opportunity to restore the glory of their culture and religion, wounded by Muslim conquerors. Historians like Audrey Trushka, author of a sympathetic biography of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb XI, have argued that this account of Muslims despoiling the Hindu homeland is neither a continuous historical memory nor based on accurate records of the past. For instance, it was a pious Hindu, Raja Jai Singh of Jaipur, who led Aurangzeb's armies against the Hindu warrior hero Shivaji, just as the Hindu general Man Singh had led Akbar's forces against the Hindu hero Rana Pratap, whose principal lieutenant was a Muslim, Hakim Khan Sur. But there is no gainsaying the emotional content of the Hindutva view of the past. It is for them a matter of faith that India is a Hindu nation, which Muslim rulers attacked, looted, and sought to destroy, and documented historical facts that refute this view are at best an inconvenience, at worst an irrelevance. Indeed, Trushka has disputed the widespread belief in India that Aurangzeb was a Muslim fanatic who destroyed thousands of Hindu temples, forced millions of Indians to convert to Islam, and enacted a genocide of Hindus. Though there is little doubt that he was indeed, in Jawaharlal Nehru's words, a bigot and an austere Puritan, he ended royal patronage of music, prohibited rituals of Hindu origin in his court, imposed the bigoted jizya tax on his non-Muslim subjects, withdrew land grants given to Hindus and introduced policies that favored Muslims alone. None of the other propositions she demonstrates in her work was true, least of all the claim made by many of those who fought successfully to remove his name from a prominent road in Delhi, that his ultimate aim was to eradicate Hindus and Hinduism. Historical evidence suggests that Aurangzeb did not destroy thousands of Hindu temples as is claimed, and that the ones he did destroy were largely for political reasons, that he did little to promote conversions, as evidenced by the relatively modest number of Hindus who adopted Islam during Aurangzeb's rule, that he increased the proportion of Hindus in the Mughal nobility by co-opting a number of Maratha aristocrats from the Deccan, that he gave patronage to Hindu and Jain temples and liberally donated land to Brahmins, and that millions of Hindus thrived unmolested in his empire. History is a complex affair. Aurangzeb was undoubtedly an illiberal Muslim ruler, unlike his ancestors or the brother he decapitated on his ascent to the throne, Dara Shikoh, but he was not the genocidal mass murderer and iconoclast many Hindus depict him as having been. For Trushka, who concedes that Aurangzeb demolished a few dozen temples, a historically legitimate view of Aurangzeb must explain why he protected Hindu temples more often than he demolished them. Critics find this an insufficient excuse for his intolerance. 1. Girish Shahnath, no Hindutva apologist himself, retorts, "Should we not criticize sportspersons who take money to fix matches unless they do so in most games they play? Should we defend sexual predators on the grounds that the vast majority of their interactions with women are respectful? Should we object to a serial killer being called a psychopath because we can't be sure why he targeted particular victims but not hundreds of other people he met? It is important to push back against the Hindutva idea of Muslim rulers as genocidal maniacs who destroyed shrines indiscriminately. But it is imperative we do it without explaining away Muslim religious prejudice where it exists. 12. A fairer assessment, in other words, might be to say that like many rulers of his time, whether Muslim or Hindu, Aurangzeb both protected and attacked Hindus and Muslims alike, though his religious bigotry was, of course, directed only at the former. But such nuanced accounts of Aurangzeb enjoy little traction amongst those who prefer their history in unambiguous shades of black and white. To quote Trushka once more, Aurangzeb is controversial not so much because of India's past but rather because of India's present. The narrative of Aurangzeb the bigot, which crops up largely in polarizing debates about Indian national identity, has more to do with modern politics than pre-modern history and is a byproduct and catalyst of growing intolerance in India. In this Hindutva-centered view, history is made of religion-based binaries, in which all Muslim rulers are evil and all Hindus are valiant resistors, embodiments of incipient Hindu nationalism. The Hindu nationalists believe, in Trushka's words, that India was subjected to repeated defeats over the centuries, including by generations of Muslim conquerors that enfeebled the people and their land. Many in India feel injured by the Indo-Muslim past, and their sentiments are often undergirded by modern anti-Muslim sentiments. 13. As K. N. Panikkar has pointed out, liberal and tolerant rulers such as Ashoka, Akbar, Jai Singh, Shahu Maharaj, and Wajid Ali Shah do not figure in Hindutva's list of national heroes. Indeed, where many nationalist historians extolled Akbar as the liberal, tolerant counterpart to the Islamist Aurangzeb, the Hindutva lobby has begun to attack him too, principally because he was Muslim, and like most medieval monarchs, killed princes who stood in his way, many of whom happened to be Hindu. Communal history continues past the era of Islamic rule. Among those Indians who revolted against the British, Bahadur Shah, Zinat Mahal, Maulvi Ahmadullah and General Bakr Khan, all Muslims, are conspicuous by their absence from Hindutva histories. And of course syncretic traditions such as the Bhakti movement, and Universalist religious reformers like Ram Mohan Roy and Keshav Chandra Sen, do not receive much attention from the Hindutva orthodoxy. What does is the uncritical veneration of Hindu heroes like Rana Pratap, portrayed now in Rajasthani textbooks as the victor of the Battle of Haldi against Akbar, which begs the question why Akbar and not he ruled the country for the following 3 decades, and of course Chhatrapati Shivaji, the intrepid Maratha warrior whose battles against the Mughals have now replaced accounts of Mughal kings in Maharashtra's textbooks. The Maharashtra Education Board's newly revised Class 7 history book of 2017 has eliminated all mention of the pre-Mughal Muslim rulers of India as well, including Razia Sultan, the first woman queen of Delhi, Sher Shah Suri and Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who notoriously and disastrously moved India's capital south from Delhi to Daulatabad. The educational system is the chosen battlefield for Hindutva's warriors, and curriculum revision their preferred weapon, the struggle for freedom. The debates over history are not confined to the distant past alone. Prime Minister Modi chose the anniversary of the Quit India movement in 1942 to launch a campaign called 70 Saal Azadi, Zara Yad Karo Kurbani, 70 Years of Freedom, Remember the Sacrifices. The BJP, which, led by the PM, has sought to drape itself in the mantle of nationalism, is now seeking to appropriate the freedom struggle for its cause. Ironically, the Quit India movement is an occasion the BJP could well have chosen to criticize rather than celebrate, since it resulted in the jailing by the British of all the leaders and thousands of workers of the nationalist movement, giving the Muslim League the freedom it needed to build up a support base it had lacked in the elections of 1937, and thus, strengthened the hands of those who wanted partition. But the Modi government has no intention of repudiating Quit India as a Congress folly. It wants to make heroes of freedom fighters, by implication placing them on its own side in a contemporary retelling of history pegged to the 70th anniversary of our independence. The complication is that the Sanghivadi political cause to which the BJP is embodied in the Janus Sangh, the RSS, and the Hindutva movement had no prominent freedom fighter of its own during the nationalist struggle for Azadi, freedom. The BJP traces its origin to leaders who were not particularly active during the nationalist movement. The lack of inspiration for the people in the parent body of the BJP means they have to look for role models elsewhere. The process had already begun, lest we forget, when then Chief Minister Modi moved aggressively to lay claim to the legacy of one of India's most respected founding fathers, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, before the 2014 election. In his quest to garb himself in a more distinguished lineage than his party can ordinarily lay claim to, Modi called on farmers across India to donate iron from their plows to construct a giant 550-foot statue of the Iron Man in his state, which would be by far the largest statue in the world, dwarfing the Statue of Liberty. But it will be less of a monument to the modest Gandhian it ostensibly honors than an embodiment of the overweening ambitions of its builder. Modi's motives are easy to divine. His own image had been tarnished by the communal massacre in Gujarat when he was chief minister in 2002. Identifying himself with Patel, who is portrayed as the leader who stood up for the nation's Hindus during the horrors of partition, stood up to Nehru in ordering the rebuilding of the ruined Somnath temple, and was firm on issues like Kashmir is an attempt at character building by association, Modi himself as an embodiment of the tough, decisive man of action that Patel was, rather than the destructive bigot his enemies decry. It helps that Patel is widely admired for his extraordinary role in forging India that gave him an unchallenged standing as the Iron Man. Patel has both the national appeal and Gujarati origin that appeal to Modi. The Modi as latter-day Patel message has been resonating well with many Gujaratis, who are proud to be reminded of a native son the nation looks up to, and with many of India's urban middle class, who see in Modi a strong leader to cut through the confusion and indecision of India's messy democracy. But Patel's conduct during the violence that accompanied partition stands in stark contrast to Modi's in 2002. Both Patel and Modi were faced with the serious breakdown of law and order in their respective domains, involving violence and rioting against the Muslims. In Delhi in 1947, Patel immediately and effectively moved to ensure the protection of Muslims, herding 10,000 in the most vulnerable areas to the security of Delhi's Red Fort. Because Patel was afraid that local security forces might have been affected by the virus of communal passions, he moved army troops from Madras and Pune to Delhi to ensure law and order. Patel made it a point to send a reassuring signal to the Muslim community by attending prayers at the famous Nizamuddin Dargah to convey a clear message that Muslims and their faith belonged unquestionably on the soil of India. Patel also went to the border town of Amritsar, where there were attacks on Muslims fleeing to the new Islamic State of Pakistan, and pleaded with Hindu and Sikh mobs to stop victimizing Muslim refugees. In each of these cases, Patel succeeded, and there are literally tens of thousands of people who are alive today because of his interventions. The contrast with what happened in Gujarat in 2002 is painful. Whether or not one ascribes direct blame to Modi for the pogrom that year, he can certainly claim no credit for acting in the way Patel did in Delhi. In Gujarat, there was no direct and immediate action by Modi, as the state's chief executive, to protect Muslims. Nor did Modi express any public condemnation of the attacks, let alone undertake any symbolic action of going to a masjid or visiting a Muslim neighborhood to convey reassurance. One cannot imagine Patel saying to an interviewer, as Modi did, when asked how he felt about the killings of Muslims in Gujarat, "If someone else is driving a car and we're sitting behind, even then if a puppy comes under the wheel, will it be painful or not?" 14 There is a particular irony to a self-proclaimed Hindu nationalist like Modi, whose speeches have often dripped with contempt for Muslims, laying claim to the legacy of a Gandhian leader who would never have qualified his Indian nationalism with a religious label. Sardar Patel believed in equal rights for all irrespective of their religion or caste. It is true that at the time of partition Patel was inclined to believe, unlike Nehru, that an entire community had seceded. In my biography Nehru, The Invention of India, 2003, I have given some examples of Nehru and Patel clashing on this issue. But there are an equal number of examples where Patel, if he had to choose between what was the right thing for many Hindus and what was the right thing morally, invariably plumped for the moral Gandhian approach. An example, so often distorted by the Sant Parivar apologists, was his opposition to Nehru's pact with Liaquat Ali Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, on the question of violence in East Pakistan against the Hindu minority. The Nehru-Liaquat Pact was indeed criticized by Patel and he disagreed quite ferociously with Nehru on the matter. But when Nehru insisted on his position, it was Patel who gave in, and his reasoning was entirely Gandhian, that violence in West Bengal against Muslims essentially took away Indians' moral right to condemn violence against Hindus in East Pakistan. That was not a Hindu nationalist position but a classically Gandhian approach as an Indian nationalist. History has often been contested terrain in India, but its revival in the context of 21st century politics is a sobering sign that the past continues to have a hold over the Hindutva movement in the present. While the Mughals will be demonized as a way of delegitimizing Indian Muslims, who are stigmatized as Babur-ke-Aulad, the sons of Babur rather than of the Indian soil, the arguments over Patel confirm that he and other heroes of the freedom struggle will be hijacked to the present ruling party's attempts to appropriate a halo of nationalism that none of its forebears has done anything to earn, Hindutva and culture. If the rewriting of the historical past is a vital first objective of the Hindutva project, the second is the removal of what they see as the various accretions to the Hindu idea that had arisen over the years. These accretions, to the more rabid of the Hindutva brigades, include the acceptance of difference that Vivekananda and Radhakrishnan had celebrated. Indeed, the distinctive difference between what one might call the Nehruvian version of Indian nationalism and the Hindutva version of it is the latter's active rejection of different interpretations and the diversity of representations for which the Indian cultural tradition had become known, and which other Hindus portrayed as the strength of their culture. One aspect of this is the relentless campaign being waged against heterodox interpretations of Hinduism itself, and this in the name of a faith which proudly includes no concept of heresy. Thus Hindutva mobs attacked and vandalized the invaluable Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute's library in Pune to protest its cooperation with the research work of the historian James Lane, whose book allegedly cast aspersions on the parentage of Shivaji. The courts offer a less dramatic form of censorship, since Hindutva activists can invoke Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes insults to religious sentiments, though the intent was only to outlaw inflammatory writings published with deliberate and malicious intent. Under this provision, serious scholars like Wendy Doniger, who has authored several learned and brilliant studies of Hinduism, have been sued, and publishers, intimidated by the forces arrayed against them and reluctant to spend what it would take to defend their authors' freedoms, have usually caved in. One of Doniger's books on Hinduism was not only withdrawn from the marketplace by its publishers, but all existing copies pulped in order not to give offense to the Hindutva lobby. The destruction and pulping of books, and the burning of libraries, is possible because the colonial-era law criminalizes even accurate statements about Indian religion and history if these offend the sentiments of any community in India. Still, to see such actions being carried out in the name of the Hindu faith is profoundly disquieting. In the Hindu culture that I grew up with, books are revered. If I so much as accidentally touched a fallen book or even a magazine or newspaper with my foot, I was brought up to bend down, touch it again with my fingertips in apology and apply my fingers to my eyes and forehead to beg forgiveness from the goddess Saraswati for my transgression, a practice I still perform in my 7th decade. This respect for the printed word can be found among Hindus of every part of the country. How can people who claim to be Hindu not just disrespect but actually destroy books? The destruction of some people's books is inevitably accompanied by the promotion of other books. Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, not known to be an RSS sympathizer but aggressive in her cultural nationalism, proposed the adoption of the Bhagavad Gita as the Rashtriya Granth, or National Holy Book. There are 4 problems with Sushma Swaraj's advocacy of the Bhagavad Gita as our national holy book, of which the first is that, to cite no less a source than Prime Minister Modi himself, we already have a national holy book, It's called the Constitution of India. The second is that we are a land of multiple faiths, each of which has its own holy books. On what basis would we pick any one of them in the capacity of a national holy book? Which Sikh would put the Gita ahead of the Guru Granth Sahib, for instance? And if the answer to that question is, as SMT Swaraj suggests, that it is the holiest book of the overwhelming Hindu majority of our population, the proposition is contestable, like most things in Hindu philosophy. As a practicing, and reasonably widely read, Hindu myself, I find many ideas in the Upanishads and the Puranas that are not in the Gita. I see Hinduism as a pluralistic faith of many holy books and many ways of worshipping the divine. You don't have to agree with those Hindu scholars who argue that the Gita, being part of an Itihasa, a subset of Smriti, that which is heard and remembered, orally, ranks lower in the hierarchy of Hindu sacred texts than the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are Smriti, seen, heard, and recorded divine revelation. But such arguments apart, there is no doubt that there are many views of the relative merits of several Indian holy books. SMT Swaraj, like many before her, including Vivekananda and Gandhiji, may be inspired by the Gita, but other, equally devout, Hindus might have other preferences. As Dayanand might have asked, why not the Rig Veda, for instance, the primordial revelatory text of the Hindu faith? Why not the Smriti text known as the Srimad Bhagavatam, or Bhagavata Purana, which is recited for an entire week, Saptaham, every year in many Hindu temples and homes? The quest to anoint a national holy book will not just divide Indians, it will divide Hindus as well. But it's the fourth problem that's most relevant to a political discussion of the issue. For a government minister to raise the idea of a national holy book serves to ignite not just controversy, but fears of a majoritarian project that will slowly but surely erode India's pluralist, officially secular, identity and replace it with an overtly Hindu one. Signs of such inclinations have been accumulating since the BJP rode to power in May 2014. There has been the overt declaration by RSS leader Mohan Bhagwat that all Indians are Hindus 15, and by implication that those who do not consider themselves Hindus aren't actually Indian, and don't belong here. There's the statement by a minister, Giriraj Singh, that those who don't vote for Modi should move to Pakistan 16, and the one by another minister, Sadhvi Niranjana Jyoti, that people are either followers of Rama or bastards, Ramzayat Yagma Ramzayat. Neither of these offenders has been required to pay for their statements by relinquishing their seats on Prime Minister Modi's Council of Ministers. There was the Shiv Sena MP, a member of the ruling coalition, shoving food down the throat of a fasting Muslim during Ramzan, and getting away without the slightest censure from the ruling party. 17 There have been numerous incidents of communal violence, instigated for political purposes no doubt, but instilling fear in the targeted minorities. And there was the faintly ridiculous episode of the mass conversion of 57 bewildered Bengali Muslims in Agra, through a mix of intimidation and inducement, under the Sant Parivar's long-dormant Ghar Wapsi scheme. 18 Many of them, it seems, were illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, who thought that signing up would be an excellent dodge to regularize their status in India. The resultant uproar put Ghar Wapsi on the back burner, but the reconversion to the parent faith of those Indians who are not Hindu remains a cherished Hindutva project. As Manmohan Vadya of the RSS has explained, Ghar Wapsi is a natural urge to connect to our roots. So SMT Swaraj's declaration joins a long list of statements and actions by our Hindutva-inspired rulers that cumulatively have stirred disquiet across the country. Is this wise? It is ironic that Prime Minister Modi keeps on emphasizing the message of development and economic transformation, while his aides persist in raising bogeys that their leader has been attempting to lay to rest. There is little doubt that after the BJP road to power on a mantra of inclusive development SAB Ka Saath, SAB Ka Vikasit's Hindutva core has begun to take advantage of its proximity to government to assertively push a sectarian agenda. As has been noted, Hindutva acolytes are being appointed to research professorships and vice-chancellorships. The Indian Council of Historical Research was headed for 3 years by a true believer whose Hindutva credentials reportedly outshine his historical ones. Textbooks in BJP-ruled states like Maharashtra and Rajasthan are being rewritten to privilege ancient Hindu glories, and Sanskrit is being promoted. Some of this, one might argue, is inevitable in any democracy after a transfer of power from one ruling dispensation to another. But some, at least, distracts from the Prime Minister's central, and oft-repeated, message that economic growth is his faith, the Constitution is his holy book and Parliament is his temple. Just as investors tend not to come to war zones, which is why peace on our borders is in our national interests, so too do investors prefer to risk their capital in harmonious societies that are focused on the future rather than divided by the past. The BJP and its government should heed one simple dictum: leave religion to the personal space and preference of every Indian. Let us have no national holy book, just as our Constitution forbids us from having a national religion. Our country was once divided over religion. Let us not now promote a partition in the Indian soul that will be as bad as the partition we have already endured on Indian soil. Let us not awake demons that 7 decades of secular Indian democracy have put to rest after the tragic horrors of 1947. It is time to let sleeping dogmas lie. Narrow-minded bigotry. Hindutva takes a dully static view of India's cultural tradition, ignoring its capacity to react to and absorb foreign influences, and negating its inherent dynamism. In the name of this limited and narrow view of Hindu culture, and in addition to its threats to books, Hindutva activists have assaulted a filmmaker for allegedly planning to shoot a love scene between a Rajput princess and a Muslim conqueror, of which more later, vandalized exhibitions of M.F. Hussein's paintings because he had depicted Hindu goddesses in the nude, disrupted the shooting of the Indo-Canadian Deepa Mehta's film on Banaras widows for insulting an age-old Hindu practice, denigrated the Malayalam writer Kamala Das for her conversion to Islam as Kamala Suraya, banned A.K. Ramanujam's classic text on the hundreds of versions of the Ramayana from the syllabus of Delhi University, and trashed a Samat exhibition on the Ayodhya dispute. The politicization of culture is truly complete under India's Hindutva government. Of these, the assault on M.F. Hussain and his works was typical of Hindutva intolerance. In 1996, a mob destroyed several paintings of the artist at an exhibition in Ahmedabad, outraged that a Muslim artist had portrayed Hindu goddesses in the nude. Hussain had long been known to use Hindu iconography. Goddesses and apsaras were among his favorite themes, and he had depicted Indira Gandhi as Durga, and the actress Madhuri Dixit as the Apsara Menaka, to telling effect in the past, infusing his work with energetic reimaginings of the tales and legends of Hindu tradition. But rather than feeling flattered that a Muslim artist should draw so liberally from the Hindu ethos, the self-appointed custodians of Hindu culture were outraged that he had done so. An irate Hindutva cadre declared that no Muslim had the right to portray Hindu deities any way he wishes, going on to demand that Hussein's paintings should all be immersed in the Ganga, so they might be simultaneously cleansed and destroyed. At one time one could have said that this was not Hindu behavior, and indeed the paintings objected to had been displayed for 20 years previously without any Hindu objecting to them. But this was not about Hinduism, it was about Hindutva politics. The Bajrang Dal and its ilk were practicing a basic form of political Me Tooism. Having seen successive governments pandering to the offended sentiments of minority communities, they wanted to show they could be offended too, and thereby bend society to their will. After the vandalism came the legal harassment of the nonagenarian artist by malicious lawsuits seeking his prosecution for allegedly having offended the petitioner's notions of morality by the use of nudity in his art, particularly in paintings of Hindu goddesses and in the depiction of the contours of India in the shape of a semi-nude female figure. The piling up of a number of cases motivated essentially by anti-Muslim bigotry drove Hussain into self-imposed exile in Dubai and London and deprived India of a national treasure. So many abusive cases were filed against him that a court even went so far as to attach his home and his property, a decision later reversed by the Supreme Court. But Hussain feared the harassment would not end there. The moment he set foot in Delhi or Mumbai, he said, he was sure to be dragged off to the lockup, tormented by legal proceedings. He was nearly 91 when he fled the country, at an age when he should have been living as a beloved and honored eminence in his native land. But he did not want to spend his last years battling the persecution of the petty hypocrites who had turned on him. So he stayed away, and passed away in exile. Delhi High Court Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul, later elevated to the Supreme Court, authored a magisterial judgment in 2007 disposing of several of these cases in a learned, closely argued and meticulously footnoted ruling that bears detailed reading and extensive citation. Point 19 Recalling the richness of India's 5,000-year-old culture, the judge noted, ancient Indian art has never been devoid of eroticism, where sex worship and graphical representation of the union between man and woman has been a recurring feature. The sculpture on the earliest temples of the Mithana image or the erotic couples in Bhubaneswar, Konark, and Puri in Orissa, 150 to 1250 CE, Khajuraho in Madhya Pradesh, 900 to 1050 CE, Limbojimata Temple at Dulmel, Mersana, 10th century CE, Kupgalu Hill, Bellary, Madras, and Nilkantha Temple at Sunak near Baroda are fine examples of this. Even the very concept of the lingam of the god Shiva resting in the center of the yoni is in a way representation of the act of creation, the union of Prakriti and Purusha. The ultimate essence of a work of ancient Indian erotic art has been religious in character and can be enunciated as a state of heightened delight or ananda, the kind of bliss that can be experienced only by the spirit. But Hussein's tormentors seem to know nothing of these ancient Hindu traditions. Instead, they profess to be defending their idea and the nation's cultural integrity. In objecting to his use of nudity, they were in fact being far more Puritan, in the Christian sense of the term, than Hindu. Instead of applauding the decision of a Muslim artist to derive inspiration from the ancient legends of his homeland, they accused him of desecrating a faith that was not his. Instead of honoring an artist who had revived worldwide appreciation of the richness and diversity of the sources of Indian culture, they attacked him for insulting Indian culture, reducing Indianness to the narrow bigotry of their own blinkers. It is a disgrace that India allowed the most intolerant elements of its society to derail the life and work of such a great artist. These so-called Hindus had clearly never seen the inside of any of our ancient temples, had never marveled at Khajuraho or seen a sunset at Konark. Theirs is a notion of Bharatiya Sanskriti that is profoundly inauthentic, because it can be traced back no further than the Puritanism that accompanied the Muslim conquests. The elderly artist had sought the dismissal of various cases filed against him for allegedly offending public decency and morality by his obscene use of nudity in his paintings, particularly those of Hindu goddesses and of Bharat Mata. While Justice Kaul's ruling took care of the legal aspects of the cases against Hussain, his larger observations on the issue deserve the attention of every thinking Indian. The most important of these, I believe, is the judge's rejection of the tendency of thin-skinned, or maliciously motivated, people across the country to claim to be offended by artistic and literary works. If you're easily offended, he argues, don't read the book, look at the painting or open the website that offends you, but don't prevent the artist or writer from enjoying his constitutionally protected freedom of expression. What is vital, according to Justice Kaul, is to look at the work of art from the artist's point of view, his or her intent rather than the hypersensitive viewer's reaction. Lest he be promptly denounced by the Hindutva Brigade as a deracinated pseudo-secularist, the judge wisely cites Swami Vivekananda's words in defense of his approach: we tend to reduce everyone else to the limits of our own mental universe and begin privileging our own ethics, morality, sense of duty and even our sense of utility. All religious conflicts arose from this propensity to judge others. If we indeed must judge at all, then it must be according to his own ideal, and not by that of anyone else. It is important, therefore, to learn to look at the duty of others through their own eyes and never judge the customs and observances of others through the prism of our own standards. But Justice Kaul goes even further in extending the boundaries of the permissible in India. Nudity and sex, he argues, have an honored place in art and literature. In the land of the Kama Sutra, we shy away from its very name, he asks in surprise. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and so does obscenity. In Hindu tradition, sex was embraced as an integral part of a full and complete life. It is most unfortunate that India's new Puritanism is being carried out in the name of cultural purity, and a host of ignorant people are vandalizing art and pushing us towards a pre-Renaissance era. I am not disrespecting those of my Hindu readers who, while fully respecting Hussain as an artist, and without expressing any of the communal bigotry that I found particularly distasteful about this affair, nonetheless expressed anguish at seeing representations of goddesses in the nude. They wrote to me at the time of their hurt that images they worshipped should have been so depicted. Many asked why Hussain has not depicted figures of other faiths, including his own, undressed. He had once painted the Prophet's wife as a fully clad woman in a sari which even covered her head. Several added that this was because Hindus are a pushover, other faiths are more robust in their self-defense, whereas Hindus like me are all too willing to accept being insulted. There's a lot to be said about all this that go beyond the scope of this book. But some points must be made. First, I don't feel insulted by the paintings because, unlike the Danish cartoonists who caricatured the Prophet Muhammad, no insult was intended. Hussain was, after all, a major artist, with a long record of being inspired by Hindu mythology as a vital source of inspiration for his work. His paintings of goddesses were consistent with 50 years of his paintings of other iconic Hindu images, clad and unclad. Hussain, who grew up in Pandharpa, a major pilgrim center, and spent all his formative years interacting with devout Hindus, watching Hindu festivals, and drawing nourishment from these influences, was fascinated by Hindu gods. More than the Prophet or any Muslim imagery, what fired his imagination was Hindu India, in which he was reared and which he sought to celebrate. I saw the paintings in that context. His critics saw them out of context, and judging by some emails I received, grossly exaggerated what the paintings depicted. Hussain saw his paintings as being within a millennial Indian tradition in which nudity has been widely used in art, including on temple walls. So did I. In Thiruvananthapuram's annual Adikal Bhagavathi festival, the goddess is routinely portrayed topless in posters throughout the city. Hussain as an artist had long used form to suggest ideas beyond form. Images in his works are both less and more than realistic depictions of what they portray. His paintings are full of metaphors and allusions. The body, he often said, is a representation of something formless, illusory, a form of Maya. As a Hindu, I did not see his goddesses as literal depictions of the images I worship. I believe in the Upanishad view that the divine is essentially unknowable, and that all worship consists of human beings stretching out their hands to that which they cannot touch. But since we humans, with our limited minds, need something more specific to aid our imaginations, we visualize God in forms that we find more easily recognizable. Hinduism, in accepting that need, also gives its adherents an infinite variety of choices about how to imagine God. That's why there are 333,000, or million, names and depictions of the divine in Hinduism. Each Hindu may pick the ones he wishes to venerate, and the form in which he wishes to venerate them. There's nothing more authentic about a Raja Ravi Varma image of Sarasvati than that of a calendar artist. Each is imagining the goddess according to his own sensibility. As a Hindu, I had no difficulty in according Hussain the same right. The question of why Hussain doesn't paint Muslim figures in the nude is a red herring. The Islamic tradition is a different one from either the Hindu or the Western. Islam, after all, prohibits any visual depiction of the Prophet, whereas visualizing our gods and goddesses is central to the practice of Hinduism. It is time all Indians, but especially Hindus, woke up to what is being done to our heritage in our name. To reduce the soaring majesty of an inclusive, free-ranging, eclectic, and humane faith to the petit bourgeois morality of narrow-minded bigots is a far greater betrayal of our culture than anything an artist can paint. For where, in the Hindutva Brigade's definition of Bharatiya Sanskriti, do the erotic sculptures of Khajuraho belong? Should their explicitly detailed couplings not be pulled down, as fashion TV's cable signals were during the last BJP government? What about the Kama Sutra, the tradition of the Devadasis, the eros of the Krishna Leela? Are they all un-Indian now? When the late, great Nobel Prize-winning Mexican poet Octavio Paz wrote his Civilization to Our Civilization, in light of India, he devoted an entire section to Sanskrit erotic poetry, basing himself, among other things, on the Buddhist monk Vidyakara's immortal 11th century compilation of 1,728 kavya, poems, many of which are exquisitely profane. Are poets like Lata Hashandra or Bhavakadevi, who 1,000 years ago wrote verse after verse describing and praising the female breast, to be expelled from the Hindutva canon of Bharatiya Sanskriti? Should we tell the Octavio Paz of the future seeking to appreciate the attainments of our culture that the televised Mahabharata is Bharatiya Sanskriti, but a classical portrayal of the erotic longings of the gopis for Krishna is not? The televised Mahabharata, which broke a viewership record set by its predecessor the Ramayana series, has much to answer for. It would be unwise to underestimate the significant role of Ramnanda Sagar's Ramayana serial on Doordarshan in promoting Hindutva revival through a cardboard depiction of Rama as a Bollywood B-film hero, complete with crude special effects, melodramatic dialogue, and theatrical acting. Encouraged by its success, B.R. Chopra offered similar treatment to the Mahabharata. Both epics became the most widely watched shows on television, attracting some 92% of all television viewers to their weekly telecasts. A nation glued to its television sets in an era where there was only one channel, the public broadcaster Doordarshan, found itself alternately unified and exalted by seeing its collective national myths rendered simply and accessibly on the small screen. One of the many ironies of contemporary India is how a secular government and a materialistic Bollywood combine to produce the religious underpinnings for the rise of Hindu cultural nationalism in India. This has actually continued into the present day. There has been a proliferation of television channels, but several show hugely popular serials, the Indian version of soap operas, which embody and propagate conservative Hindu values. Many Bollywood superstars are themselves Muslim, including 5 who sport the surname Khan, and they have all portrayed devout Hindu heroes and danced to devotional songs before Hindu idols. The portrayal of sympathetic Muslim characters in popular cinema, like the brave and patriotic Pathan in Zanjeer, 1972, or the lovable Akbar in Amar Akbar Anthony, 1977, has declined, subliminally reinforcing the notion of India as a land of Hindu ethos rather than pluralist culture. Hindutva hypocrisy is also much in evidence in relation to alcohol, deemed to be un-Hindu and officially banned in the Prime Minister's own home state of Gujarat, though, reportedly, widely available, at a price, under the table. Wide and frequent are the calls for prohibition, and rare indeed the figure in Indian public life who would be willing to be photographed with a drink in his hand. And yet alcohol has a hoary history in Hindu literature. As I have mentioned earlier, Soma, or Samras, was the favorite beverage of the Vedic deities and was offered in most of the sacrifices performed in honor of Rig Vedic gods like Indra, Agni, Varun, and others. The Vedic gods were no teetotalers, and drinking was an essential feature of these sacrifices. For instance, in one ritual, performed at the beginning of the Vahapaya sacrifice, the historian D. Anja describes a collective drinking ritual in which a sacrificer offered 5 cups to Indra as well as 17 cups of Soma and 17 cups of Surya to 34 gods. 20. A large variety of some 50 intoxicating drinks are mentioned in ancient Hindu texts. Ja tells us that the use of alcohol by men was quite common, though sometimes discouraged among Brahmins, and instances of drinking among women were not rare. Sanskrit literature, including the plays of Kalidasa, and Buddhist Jataka texts, frequently mention alcoholic drinks. Ancient Hindus were far less puritanical than those who claim to be custodians of their legacy today. The prohibitionist instincts of Hindutva's shock troops find their sternest rebuke in the divine hedonism of their most ancient gods. but the disapproval of alcohol as a sinful Western indulgence is of a piece with the assault on any cultural practice deemed to be insufficiently Hindu by the self-appointed guardians of Indian culture. The news from UP, telling us that Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath's anti-Romeo squads have questioned 2137,520 people for being out with girls between March 22 and December 15, 2017, has offered a sobering reminder of how far moral policing has gone in today's India. Worse, it turns out that of those questioned, 933,099 have been of 7,706 FIRs issued against 3,003 persons. All this has happened in less than 9 months. So this is what a once free society has been reduced to: multiple police squads, each consisting of a sub-inspector and 2 constables, patrolling Uttar Pradesh's university campuses, college yards, cinema theaters, parks, and other public places, looking for Romeos. The term seems to be loosely defined, entitling the cops to stop and question any young couple. While it may have once been intended to curb harassment by louts loafing in public places to tease unwary women, the sheer numbers reported confirm that the harassment is now coming mainly from the authorities and not from their targets. The term anti-Romeo squad is itself telling. It traces its origins to the roadside Romeos of my own youth, raffish fellows in drainpipe pants, wavy locks, and rakish mustaches, usually unemployed, who lounged about whistling at, or singing snatches of Bollywood film songs to, passing women. They were usually ignored, and mostly harmless. Today's UP police have a far broader target. A Romeo is any young man aspiring to woo his own Juliet. Shakespeare's Romeo, after all, defied convention and evaded his disapproving parents to pursue his love for a woman from the wrong family. That is precisely what Yogi Adityanath does not want Romeo's 21st century imitators to do. The anti-Romeo squads are merely the latest sign of the continuing assault on any cultural practice deemed to be insufficiently Hindu by the self-appointed guardians of Indian culture. A new spurt of arrests is likely as the anti-Romeo squads double their vigilance for Valentine's Day. Until Yogi's victory, policing Valentine's Day lovers was a task undertaken by lumpen activists of assorted Senas and Dals. Now, in a sort of reverse privatization, it is a task that has been taken up by the BJP-run state. And what of the freelance anti-romance troublemakers? After years of attacking couples holding hands on February 14th, trashing stores selling Valentine's Day greeting cards and shouting slogans outside cafes with canoodling couples, Hindutva activists changed tactics last year. The Hindu Mahasabha announced that it would send squads out to catch any unmarried couples out for a tryst on Valentine's Day and promptly cart them off to a temple to be married. And, if the Hindutva MP and Godse admirer Sakshi Maharaj has his way, they will be lectured on the virtues of producing between 4 and 10 children forthwith, in order to give his fantasies a voting majority. The police uniform-clad face of intolerance might be amusing if it weren't for the fact that all involved are deadly serious. The nativists argue that Valentine's Day is an imported celebration, which it is, but so is Christmas, or Eid al-Nabi, or International Women's Day, for that matter, and they don't have the nerve to attack those. They also argue that it is un-Indian because it celebrates romantic love, and they're completely wrong. Historians tell us that there was a well-established Hindu tradition of adoration for Kamadeva, the Lord of Love, which was only abandoned after the Muslim invasions in medieval times. but then no one in the Hindu Mahasabha has any real idea of Hindu tradition. Their idea of Indian values is not just primitive and narrow-minded, it is also profoundly anti-historical. In fact, what young people call PDA or public display of affection was widely prevalent in ancient India. As late as the 11th century, Hindu sexual freedoms were commented on by shocked travelers from the Muslim world. Today's young celebrants of Valentine's Day are actually upholding India's ancient pre-Muslim culture, albeit in a much milder form than is on display, for instance, in Khajuraho. In a sense, February 14th is their attempt at observing Kamadeva Divas. How ironic that they should incur the disapproval of the self-appointed custodians of Hindu culture. But let's face it, this is less about teenagers dating than about the ruling dispensation's political project of transforming secular India into their idea of a Hindu state. Tradition is sought to be upheld in the name of culture. Traditionalism benefits those who want to uphold the social order, ensure discipline and conformity, and prevent radical change. Love affairs, which may after all cross caste or religious lines, are to be disapproved of for threatening this social order. Worse still, they reflect the autonomy of the individual and her right to choose, which is anathema to those who would prefer to make faceless cow worshippers of us all. 21 Would it have been better if the BJP government, with its fondness for rebaptizing government schemes with new Sanskrit appellations, gave serious thought to just calling Valentine's Day Kamadeva Divas, to link it to ancient Hindu culture? But it's in the self-appointed part that the real problem lies. All this is being done in the name of a notion of Indian culture whose assertion is based on a denial of India's real rather than imagined past. India's culture has always been a capacious one, expanding to include new and varied influences, from the Greek invasions to the British. The central battle in contemporary Indian civilization is that between those who, to borrow from Walt Whitman, acknowledge that as a result of our own historical experience, we are vast, we contain multitudes, and those who have presumptuously taken it upon themselves to define in increasingly narrower terms what is truly Indian, tarnishing the Taj. The latest victim of this definitional exercise is India's most iconic monument, the Taj Mahal. In a country whose toxic politics has led to everything from festival firecrackers to animal husbandry, the care and protection of cows, of which more anon, taking on a communal, religious coloring, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that its most famous monument hasn't been exempt. The Taj Mahal is India's most magnificent piece of architecture. Built nearly 4 centuries ago by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan as a mausoleum for his beloved wife, who had borne him 13 children and died in the process of producing the 14th, it attracts tens of millions of tourists and is by far the country's most photographed building. The exquisite marble monument to love was hailed by India's only winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Rabindranath Tagore, as a teardrop on the cheek of time. But the Taj now has other reasons for tears. Its gleaming white surface is yellowing as a result of rampant air pollution from factories and small businesses around it, as well as the Mathura refinery not far away. Repairs are needed so frequently that scaffolding often obscures its famous minarets. There has been a 35% drop in foreign tourists from the 743,000 who went there in 2012 to the 480,000 tourists who came in 2015. 2. The crowded and grimy town of Agra in Uttar Pradesh, which hosts the Taj, puts visitors off. American basketball player Kevin Durant sparked a row with his graphic descriptions of the awful conditions around the Taj Mahal after a visit there in the summer of 2017. And worst of all, the new ruling party in Uttar Pradesh, the BJP, has decided that far from being proud of its most famous edifice, it wants as little to do with it as possible. Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister, began the controversy by deploring the fact that his government used to give models of the Taj as gifts to visiting foreign dignitaries. Declaring that the monument did not reflect Indian culture, the yogi announced the government would be handing out copies of the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, instead. 23. It got worse. The Uttar Pradesh Tourism Department issued a brochure listing the state's principal attractions and omitted the Taj Mahal altogether. The state's, and the country's, biggest tourism draw was denied any cultural heritage funding in the allotments for the current fiscal year. Domestic tourists have also decreased significantly. Indian tourists reportedly prefer the attractions of the holy city of Varanasi in the same state, Uttar Pradesh. This mirrors and reinforces the monument's neglect by the state government in favor of Hindu religious tourism. But the objection to the Taj is more basic. One extremist BJP legislator labeled the tomb a blot on the fair name of his state, a relic that had been built by traitors. The Taj Mahal should have no place in Indian history, he said, demanding that India's history be changed to remove it. 24. The ruling party's campaign against the Taj Mahal might seem bizarre. After all, why would anyone undermine a universally admired architectural marvel that is such a revenue generator? But those familiar with the tortured prejudices of the ruling BJP would be less surprised. The attacks on the Taj are part of their politics of hate towards anything associated with the history of the centuries of Muslim rule in India. As we have seen, to many in the BJP, this was a period of slavery and discrimination against the Hindu population, conducted by foreign invaders who had despoiled a prosperous land, destroyed temples and palaces, assaulted Hindu women and converted millions of Hindus. In their telling, this sordid saga culminated in the vivisection of the motherland in the 1947 partition of India by the British, which created Pakistan. That this is an unduly simplistic black and white rendition of a complex history, in which there was far more assimilation and coexistence than religious conflict, is irrelevant to Hindu chauvinists who constitute the bulk of the BJP's support base. To them, the Taj is an enduring symbol not of love, but of conquest and humiliation. Resentment that a monument built by a Muslim emperor is Hindu-majority India's most recognizable monument was, in the past, a fringe obsession of the loony Hindu right. But the fringe is now in power in Uttar Pradesh and its enablers rule the roost in Delhi. Before becoming chief minister in a surprise appointment by his party, Yogi Adityanath was best known for his incendiary, anti-Muslim speeches, laden with toxic rhetoric, and for leading a volunteer squad of hoodlums who specialized in attacking Muslim targets. Adityanath spent 11 days in jail in 2007 for fomenting religious tension through hate speech, earned notoriety by calling India's most beloved film star, the Muslim Shah Rukh Khan, a terrorist 25 and has urged his party's government in New Delhi to emulate Donald Trump's travel ban on Muslims. But even he has been obliged by public and political opinion to surrender to national outrage over the latest controversy. After stoking it in the first place, the chief minister was forced to visit Agra officially to assure an anxious public that his government was committed to protecting the Taj. What is important, he conceded grudgingly, is that it was built by the blood and sweat of India's farmers and laborers. 26. This acknowledgement is only partly reassuring. It opens the door to another divisive fringe view of the Taj, that of the chauvinist historian P. N. Oak, who argued that the monument was originally a Shiva temple named Teju Mahalaya. Some misguided Hindutva elements have already been caught trying to perform a Shiva puja in the mausoleum. The RSS, the parent body of the Hindu family of organizations that includes the BJP, has called for Muslims to be prohibited from praying there as well. To many Indians, in these circumstances, the BJP's newfound love for the Taj might be as alarming as its well-expressed hate for it. Meanwhile, while the yogi was busy criticizing the Taj, it was the Kerala government far away in the south that brought out an ad saluting the Taj for its role in helping tourists discover India. The Taj Mahal is merely the latest victim of a political campaign over Indian history that seeks to reinvent the idea of India itself. Whereas for 7 decades after independence, Indianness rested on faith in the country's pluralism, the ascent of the Hindu chauvinist BJP has brought with it attempts to redefine the country as a Hindu nation long subjugated by foreigners. This cultural nationalism by the Hindu right, stoking long-buried resentments and promoting hatred for the Muslim minority, is not just deeply divisive, it undermines the country's global soft power and fragments its domestic political and social discourse. As the author Nayantara Sahgal wrote, vast slices of our multi-religious, multicultural heritage, which includes our literature, architecture, language, food, music, dance, dress, and manners, are being disinherited and disowned, leaving us shrunk into a monoculture which is not only not Hinduism, but the antithesis of all that India has stood for, worked for, and safeguarded as a proud and cherished inheritance. 27. At almost the same time as the Taj controversy came one over a film on the Rajput queen Padmavati, who is said to have immolated herself, together with 16,000 other Rajput women, rather than be captured alive by the invading Delhi Sultan Alauddin Khilji. The historicity of the incident is somewhat in doubt. No contemporary account of Khilji's attack on Chittorgarh, including by historians accompanying his forces, mentions the queen. But Padmavati became legend more than 2 centuries later, when the Sufi mystic poet Malik Mohammed Jayasi devoted his lyrical epic Padmavat to her story. It has been suggested that Jayasi did not intend his tale to be taken literally, and that he had chosen Khilji's attack on Chittor because its name included the word chit, consciousness. His poem is said to have been an allegory for the union of mind and soul, under attack from external forces, with the man-woman story a standard trope of the Persian mystic poetry tradition. But literature, once published, acquires a life of its own. The tale was picked up and retold with enthusiasm by Bengali bards, Rajasthani folk tellers, and even the English Colonel Todd, who included Padmavati's tale in his compilation, Annals and Antiquities of Rajputana. In countless retellings, Padmavati was soon deified. She became the symbol of Rajput female honor and purity, nobly resisting the lustful Muslim. Her self-immolation, Jawahar, the epitome of sacrificial Hindu womanhood. The reputed site of her suicide became a tourist attraction. The legend grew, with one colorful figure, the head of a Rajput organization, the Karni Sena, claiming to be directly descended from her. When confronted with the theory that she was fictional, he replied, "I am 37th in her direct line of descent. Am I a ghost?" The controversy confirmed once again that to some Hindus, The difference between historical fact and cultural myth matters not at all. What is remembered and believed is as important as what is verifiable. No less an ardent secularist than India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had written 7 decades earlier, facts and fiction are so interwoven together as to be inseparable, and this amalgam becomes an imagined history, which may not tell us exactly what happened but does tell us something equally important: what people believed had taken place, what they thought their heroic ancestors were capable of, and what ideals inspired them. Thus, this imagined history, mixture of fact and fiction, or sometimes only fiction, becomes symbolically true and tells us of the minds and hearts and purposes of the people. 28 This, in a nutshell, explained Rajput passions over the depiction of a cultural heroine who may or may not have existed. With so much riding on Padmavati's image, the Bollywood filmmaker who set out to make a film of her story found himself treading unwittingly on the newly roused passions about the past. The Karni Sena trashed his film set at Jagar Fort in Jaipur, and disrupted further shooting in a new, less authentic, location at Kolhapur, accusing him of filming a love scene between the Hindu queen and the Muslim invader. Though he denied this, the Rajput community then successfully delayed the release of the film, claiming that it distorted history. The fact that they had not actually seen it before making this claim was apparently irrelevant to the protesters, as well as to 4 BJP chief ministers, who preemptively announced a ban on screening the yet unreleased film in their states. When the film was eventually released on the orders of the Supreme Court, violent protests by hoodlums, including an attack on a school bus, successfully intimidated theater owners, so that the film was not shown in several states even though they were free to screen it. Taking offense is the name of the game these days. Hurting the sentiments of a community is the name of the crime. The old Hindu boasts of expansive tolerance are wearing thin. But the filmmaker should well have been warned by the experience of another film a decade ago, this time unconnected to any religious community. The threat of protests and possible prosecution had caused a Bollywood star and producer to retitle a film originally named Bilud Barber without the second word, because the hairdressers community absurdly protested that the term barber was an insult to their profession. It may not seem to matter very much what some lumpen elements think of a Bollywood film, or of Valentine's Day, for that matter. But it is precisely this kind of narrow-mindedness that also led to the notorious pulping of Wendy Doniger's erudite study of Hinduism. If these intolerant bullies are allowed to get away with their lawless acts of intolerance and intimidation, we are allowing them to do violence to something profoundly vital to our survival as a civilization. Pluralist and democratic India must, by definition, tolerate plural expressions of its many identities. To allow the self-appointed arbiters of Bharatiya Sanskriti to impose their hypocrisy and double standards on the rest of us is to permit them to define Indianness down until it ceases to be Indian. But I am not optimistic about the prospects for any such development. My late father, Chandran Tharoor, used to tell me more than 5 decades ago that India is not just the world's largest democracy, it is also the world's largest hypocrisy. The wisdom and accuracy of his perception was again on display when my 2 attempts to introduce a private member's bill to amend Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes homosexuality, were comprehensively defeated in the Lok Sabha by homophobic bigotry in the name of Hindutva. Here was the spectacle of a parliamentary democracy refusing to entertain debate, the ruling party using its brute majority to defeat a motion without even a discussion. How can a deliberative legislature in what claims to be the temple of democracy dismiss an issue out of hand without even hearing the arguments in its favor or against it? And to add to the hypocrisy, nowhere in over 2,000 years of recorded Hindu texts is there any evidence that the Indian ethos was intolerant of sexual difference or gender orientation. Ours is a culture that embraces Shikandi in the Mahabharata, the homoerotic sculptures, mixed in with the rest, in Khajuraho, and the very concept of the Ardhanarishwara, the half-man half-woman embodiment of divinity. No historical records reveal the persecution or prosecution of sexual deviancy in India. Now we have the spectacle of the party of Hindutva, the self-appointed guardians of Bharatiya Sanskriti, betraying a Hindu history of tolerance in order to uphold, without debate, an iniquitous law from the British colonial era. It is a new low in the annals of Indian democracy and a triumph for Indian hypocrisy. In proposing to amend Section 377, I had explained that we shouldn't have a law on the books that can be used to oppress and harass innocent people conducting their personal lives in private. What two people do to express their love and desire for each other should be strictly between them. The government has no place in India's bedrooms. But equally important, I had tried to explain, though alas, I was not allowed to do so in Parliament, that my bill was not about sex but about freedom. Section 377 violates the constitutional rights of dignity, privacy, equality, and non-discrimination, Articles 14, 15, and 21, guaranteed to all Indian citizens. It is a British relic, drafted in 1860 and based on outdated Victorian morals rather than authentically Indian values. It has no place in 21st century India. To compound the ironies, within half an hour of the defeat of my amendment, I was rising in the same Lok Sabha to speak in favor of the Rights of Transgender Persons Bill, which had already been passed earlier in the Rajya Sabha. The passage of this progressive bill would have the indirect effect of nullifying the application of Section 377 to transgenders, while leaving it on the books to be used to harass and oppress homosexuals and straight people. How's that for both democracy and hypocrisy taken to their extreme? Ironically, the one source of hope for a progressive outcome in keeping with the long-established Hindu tradition rests with a secular institution, the judiciary. The Supreme Court's willingness to conduct a curative review of Section 377, and their assertion in a separate case that Indians enjoy a right to privacy, may well signal a return to that tradition. It is ironic that where a Hindutva-inclined majority renders our elected legislature a bastion of illiberalism, it is the unelected judiciary that remains the last repository of hope for the timeless values of our civilization.